All right. Do you dig Spring Boot? Are you a fan of using what's known as, by some circles, as the de facto standard Java toolkit? Well, you come to the right place because when it comes to CockroachDB, there's a whole lot of people out there that love to use Spring Boot. So in today's episode of Select Star, I'm going to do a little bit of live coding to demonstrate how you can take your Spring Boot app and hook it up to CockroachDB and make things sizzle. So why don't we flip over here where I've got a little app ready to go here. Well, not an app. I've got a environment here. I'm going to tweak this a little bit here so it fits on the screen better. That's too much. If you're wondering whether or not this is live or pre-recorded, now you know. So we have here is basically we're using the latest stable version of Spring Boot here, version 334. Yeah, this is Maven, but this works just the same if you're using Gradle. And we're going to use Spring Data JPA on top of Spring Web, and then all we need is a little Postgres for a driver, and we are good to go. Now, one of the most favorite things I like to implement, I saw somebody do this on a demo, and it really made me laugh, is we need to build that ever critical, hyper important application to manage employees. That's right. So what we're going to do is we need to go build a data persistence layer with Spring Boot. Okay. And we're going to define an employee object. Now we need some key attributes here. We're going to define the person's name. We're going to define what their role is in the company. All right. But this is not enough to build a persisting application. We need one more piece of information. We need a primary key value. So for CockroachDB, the recommendation here is that you use a UUID object. So it's a tried and true practice, at least on monolithic database systems, to use something like a sequence counter. However, for a distributed environment, you want to distribute the effort of generating keys. So in this situation, I don't want the bigger one. Okay. In this situation, we're going to use a UUID. That becomes a locally generatable primary key. There's no need to go back to some central server and go to a sequence counter. And it also lets you avoid hotspots. So in this situation, I'm going to tell JPA we're going to use a UUID. So it's locally generatable, and it will also distribute the load across all the various nodes in the cluster that we're going to operate on. All right. Now I need to add a little bit because this is JPA, the Java Persistence API. When you go into relational database solutions on the Java stack, this is the one that is predominantly used everywhere. There's other stacks you can use, but today we're going to focus on using JPA and the wrapping library Spring Data JPA. And that means I need to, first of all, mark this up as an entity type. All right. So I'm going to use the entity annotation on it. Now there's something else I need to put. I need to use the Jakarta persistence ID attribute here. Okay, so this tells JPA that this is the primary key for this entity type. And finally, I want JPA to go generate the UUIDs for me. I want to offload that task. And what I can do is it's got some built-in stuff here. So I'm going to say, JPA, if I hand you a null in this field for a new object, you go and use your UUID generation strategy there. And I'm gonna put a little comment here. This will let me polish it up here. So I've got my key attributes. Now I need to go create some constructor calls so I can create these objects. Okay. And I'm first going to make one where I'm going to provide every attribute. So let's wire that up. All right. So if you got everything, great. However, JPA has one other fun requirement in there. You also have to provide a, here, let's see so you can see all of it. All right. Oop. You also have to provide it an empty constructor call. So I'm going to do that. So I'm going to have the empty constructor call, but guess what? I'm not a fan of a coding practice of people invoking this approach. I'll let the framework use it when necessary, but I'm actually going to reduce the visibility of this constructor call so that my application developers are not going to invoke that constructor call. Instead, I'm going to route them to a more suitable one, but I'm going to implement this so that the framework has it as needed. And then I'm going to define one other form of a constructor, one where I don't provide the ID value. Instead, I'm just going to have the name and the role. And so in this scenario, I'm going to invoke that same constructor I had above. I'll pass on the name and the role value, but for the ID, I'll just pass in a null. And the rest is just, I'm going to let the code, the IDE generate all my getters and setters. Okay. Now the way my streaming software works is it doesn't let me show you can't see the pop-ups happening because it's a different window. So, but I'm doing the little pop-ups to do that. Now, the other thing is I'm going to have it generate an equals and a hash code value. And for now, we're going to accept the IDE's version of that. You can sit there and debate the finer points of whether or not you want to use that, in another medium. But for today's live stream, we're just going to take what it gives us. And then we're going to use its default toString generation. And so now we have a Pojo class. Oh, yeah, the thing is complaining that this has to be at least protected. It can't be, because default visibility would make it private. Okay. All right. So we have us here a nice and handy domain object. And a lot of the stuff when you're doing database design in a Java application is you got to start with the domain objects and have them defined properly so you can act upon them. So this now is our domain object. It's called an entity type from a JPA perspective, from a Java Persistence API perspective. And you can say from a database perspective, it's also this is our entity type. Okay. So they're synonymous. Now for the next layer of this, what we need to do is, since we're using Spring Data, I'm going to define a repository to access that. And again, you can't see the pop-up, so I'm trying to move it as quickly as possible here to get past it. But here I've created a interface class called employee repository. This is going to be how we interact with these types to work with the database. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend Spring Data's JPA repository type. Now, if you notice up here in the import statement, this comes from Spring Data. And if you open this type up through the IDE, you can see that it has two parameters. It has the entity type itself as one generic parameter, and it has whatever the type of the ID is. And it gives us a lot of operations. So what I'm going to do is first enter the type. We called it employee object, and then its its identifier type, which was a UUID. And this right off the cuff, as you can see, gives us a hold of some operations here. There's flushing operations. This is in JPA. JPA has a sort of a smart persistence, a caching layer based into the persistence manager, where it can queue up a series of changes and then decide when to push them onto the actual database. And that operation is called flushing. So you can either, I didn't mean to hit that. So you can either do it yourself or let JPA decide when to do that. There's also some deletion operations. You can also do a get by one. Anyway, the point is, by doing this, we've implemented a bunch of stuff here. We've already defined our domain object, and we've given ourselves an object to access by. And so for the third layer of setting up this demo application where we're going to store employee data, I'm actually going to go create a database loader. Now, normally you want to load databases from like a schema file or some other persistence managing solution. But in this case, since this is a demo app for a live stream, I'm going to load it myself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to annotate this class as a configuration class so that Spring Boot is going to scan this class and automatically pick up what's inside it. What's it called? Command line runner. And I want a copy of that repository. Oops, let me get that. Okay, so, and what am I going to do? Okay, what did I just do right there? Okay, as I said, this annotation tells Spring Boot that you need to go load this class up automatically when the app starts up, okay? Because there's bean definitions in here, Spring Bean definitions. And down here, you can see the app bean annotation annotating that this thing is basically a bean declaration. Now, the type it is called a command line runner. And if you open it up, it's a SAM, a single access method. It's basically an interface with one method in it, a run operation that can take arguments. Okay. And what it means is this thing, this Java 8 Lambda expression that turns command line arguments into whatever is going to get invoked when the Spring Boot app is up and running. So it's a great way to run some code after the app is up automatically. What kind of code are we going to run? What I'm going to do is I'm asking Spring Boot to go find an employee repository bean and inject it into this method. So the Spring Bean that gets returned back depends on this bean. So after this bean's created, it will get injected into this bean, the one we're looking at here, the definition, and then this is the code that will then get invoked when the app is up. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save a new employee object. And who do I want to put onto my team? No one other than Frodo Baggins. And what's his role? He's a ring bearer. Now, I'm going to add some more staff here. Let's go. Why not add Bilbo Baggins? What was his first job? He was a burglar. And then finally, let's round out our team with Samwise Gamgee. And what was his first job? He was gardener. Okay. So what happens if I just run this application? Now, let me back out. If you're a little new to Spring Boot, you may not be aware of it, but before I started this live stream, I went to start.spring.io and I told it what I wanted. I said, I need Spring. Let's zoom out here a little bit. I said, we need Spring Data JPA. We need Spring Web, which is what you get to get Spring Web MVC. That gives us access to their servlet container. It makes it possible to create REST endpoints. You can go create actual web pages, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to focus on REST endpoints. And I said, I need the Postgres driver. And it baked me a bare project. And it gave me this class right here, the one you can see. And I called it Select Star Demo. So it named it Select Star Demo Application. It put this annotation on there, Spring Boot application, and it says basically if I run this main method right here, the app is going to start up and do its thing. So let's do that. So I'm going to right click, and on my IDE, I'm going to click on run. And in the terminal down here, it's firing up and doing its thing. Now, I did some other stuff here before the live stream got underway, before we see the goodies in the console. I added some settings here to make sure that to point my Spring Boot app at the app. Okay. So that at my local copy of CockroachDB that I've got running. And I have some connection pool settings, but more than anything, I dialed up the log levels to super nerdy so we could actually see everything that's happening underneath in the database. So when the app starts up, we get this nice uber chic ASCII art banner for Spring, and we can see the version of Spring Boot we're on. We're on 3.3.4. And if you skim over here a little bit, you can see it's doing this, okay? It's going and creating the table for me, okay? It's creating it. I didn't write these commands, drop table, create table employee. It did it for me. Create table employee. JPA did that by looking at my domain model and figuring it out. It's got the ID type, which was a UUID, not null. That's classic settings for an identifier of that type. It also created a name, a role, and then it flagged the ID as the primary key. Now, as JPA got underway, the Tomcat servlet container started up. And then finally, let's see, it says here, started. So the app, at this point, the app was fully started. Then it ran my command line runner that I had. And what did that do? It started basically a transaction, started some save operations. And so it's invoking this insert operation, insert into employee, name, role, and ID with parameters. Now over here, I can see this is actually deep inside Hibernate. So when you use Spring Data JPA, it defaults to Hibernate as the implementation, the JPA implementation persistence provider of choice. It's using Hibernate. So here, when the metal hits the road, it is actually using Hibernate to do this. And so it's binding parameters. It's taking the arguments I fed it, Frodo Baggins and Ring Bearer, and it's also has generated a UUID here to make the key for me. And then it's going to start another transaction because I had 3 insert statements. So it's going to now insert the second one. Here's the Bilbo Baggins burglar with another generated UUID. And then here's the third one. So we've loaded a database up with content. I should be able to go over here in a terminal, Cockroach SQL. Oh, I mistyped it. Cockroach SQL insecure. I'm going to use the select star demo. Oh, select is a keyword. Next time I won't pick select. Select is a keyword, so I have to wrap it in quotes to get it past the parser. Okay, so select. Welcome to select star. Select star from employee. So here we have the 3 rows that I just created in no particular order. So this is the data that we just created. So this begs the question, can I go build some web stuff around this? Absolutely. Let's do just that. Let's build a basic API controller. So I'm going to create a class. Let's call it API controller, and I'm going to flag it as a REST controller. And let's give it a path of API employees. We'll return back a list of employee objects, and let's call it find all. It doesn't matter what the name of the method is, because when it starts up, this annotation is going to tell Spring Boot that this is a Spring MVC web controller and automatically register it with servlet container. And then this is going to give it the mapping from the URI path onto this method. So the actual name of the method doesn't matter. And this is going to be the return type. However, before I can do anything, I need a constructor call, because what do I want? I want that employee repository object. And so I'm going to register it with this constructor class. And so now what I can do is I can tap that repository and I can do the find all method. Where did this find all method come from? I don't remember making that in the repository. In fact, I don't remember making any methods in the repository. Well, I can open it up and find out this is a class. This is an interface inside of Spring Data JPA. Well, actually, if you look up here in the top left corner, you can see it's in Spring Data Comments. And we have this find all method definition where it returns a list of whatever that T type is. And we configure the T type to be employee. And so this is the part of what Spring Data does for you. You can just by convention, you can name methods and it will go and implement them for you. And some of these conventional methods are already pre-baked for us, so we don't have to do it. And so if I simply restart this app, and we're back here, and we can see this is the same inserts that we saw before, then I should have no problem. I'm going to actually, let's pull this up. I'm going to open up a new terminal because I'm going to keep that one in the database. Now let's check here. I think I've got it. Yeah, I've got it rigged for port 8000. So I should be able to curl port 8000. Remember what we called it? We called it API employees. If I do that, let's see what I get back. Well, I asked for verbose output, so the curl command gave me all that, and then it gave me this compactified JSON document. Well, let's route that through JQ and prettify the output. And there we go. This just this gave me back a readout of the 3 objects. It gave me their ID, their name, and the role. So I can see that now. However, what if in my application, maybe in the service layer, I need to get back all these employees, but I need some kind of filter. I'm trying to search for something in particular. Let me shrink this down to size. So instead of giving me everything, I'm going to filter down based on role. Like maybe the user's typing into the screen, they want to filter by role. Well, I can certainly do something like that in the service layer where I could get back this whole repository, this list of content, and then the application can filter, but that would be very inefficient. Instead, it's better to push the criteria into the database so the database can filter on my behalf. Let's craft an endpoint that we want, employees, and let's call it, we'll parameterize it, a role. That means what, this is a parameter, and we're going to get back a smaller list. And let's make this, and denote that this is a path. This is a path variable. So this is classic Spring MVC with the annotations that if the name is role, and if you denote this path variable, it's going to map this onto this. So I'm going to go in and pass it in. Okay, so it's going to do a filtering, but it's red. And what does that mean? It means that has not been implemented yet. That this method doesn't exist. It's not in the framework. Spring Data JPA doesn't have it, and I haven't built it either, but I can. If I go back over here to my repository that I created earlier, I can define a list of type employee. And guess what? That's all I have to do. Spring Data will go in and parse this. It looks for the find by prefix, and when it sees that, it then takes the rest and chops it up into tokens. Okay, accidentally jumped over. It chops it up into tokens that it can see, and then it maps them onto the domain object. So in this case, it sees that I'm trying to search based on this role, so it's going to automatically create a query filter, and it's going to basically apply this argument to that. If you want to, now what we're going to do is I'm going to restart the app one more time, and let's see what we get. So back in the console, got the same song and dance here. It's loaded the same 3 values. Now over here, again, I can do select, let's look inside the database, select star from employee, and I can see the same 3 people. Now, if you notice from one session to the next, you'll notice that the UUIDs have changed. So earlier we looked at this one, and now if we look at the same at Samwise Gamgee, the UUIDs are different. Well, that's because every time in the current configuration, JPA is dropping the table and recreating it from scratch. In fact, you can even see that in the console if you scroll up here. This is what JPA, the current setup with JPA, is doing. Drop table, create table. All right, capiche? All right, now I've got a new endpoint. So first of all, I can do the same operation I just did. Let me query API/employees and prettify it, and I can see all 3. But what if instead of doing that, what if I add a role like gardener? What do I get back? I get back 1 entry. Now this is a JSON output. This is the standard output is JSON. It's using the Jackson library under the hood for JSON serialization and deserialization. And I see I get Samwise Gamgee. So I get a list You can see the square brackets here. It's a list with one entry. But what if I want to search on something else? How about burglar? If I search on burglar, I'm going to get Bilbo Baggins. What if I want to search on ring bearer? How am I going to do that? Well, if I put a break in here, it's not going to work correctly because of that token. What you have to do is you have to put an encoded space, which is, I happen to know, is %20. So if I do a %20, it gets the space passed on through. It's ring bearer, and here we have the third item. Now with this, we're able to quickly go grab Spring Data JPA. We're able to combine it with a Postgres driver. We mixed it with Spring MVC and all in a Spring Boot application. And we're able to sit there and talk. This is CockroachDB. So I showed that in the console. We're interacting with it. And so what's the message? Are we talking about the grand glorious features of CockroachDB? Not in today's live stream. Instead, I'm showing how easy it is to go just pick up Spring Boot. And instead of talking to some other database, you can just as easily do the same thing that you always do, talking with CockroachDB. Only now, if you configure your CockroachDB cluster, maybe you're running a 15-node cluster spread across 3 different regions. Maybe you got one in the United States, one in Europe, and one in Eastern Asia. You've got 5 nodes in each region. You've configured it with a regional level failover. You have a load balancer in front of the entire cluster, and it means the same thing to the Spring Boot application. You can go to your Spring Boot application. You can define your JPA entities just like you did last year, and then you can go res up your application and talk to the system, and it works just fine. So I want to thank you for coming by for this live coding session. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you can catch future episodes of our Select Star show, and I will see you next time.
This episode is over, but your learning has just begun. Visit CockroachLabs.com to find all kinds of content to expand your knowledge.